Nelson, an army captain on leave, recently moved into a new home with his wife Jean and their daughter Maddie. The family had planned small activities during his leave, such as decorating the house and joining his daughter's activities. However, Nelson was shocked by the news of the Twin Towers attack on the WTC in New York. Driven by patriotism, Nelson went to his office without hesitation and requested to return to duty from his superior Bowers. Initially, Bowers refused because Nelson had been reassigned to a staff position at his own request, and his former team member Hal Spencer had already submitted his resignation. Therefore, Nelson no longer had a team to work with. Nelson then investigated and found that the Taliban were involved in the attack, along with Al-Qaeda, who were based in Afghanistan. Nelson concluded that he could form a team to combat Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, since the Middle East was his operational area during his service. Nevertheless, Bowers remained unmoved by Nelson's request. Spencer then tried to persuade Bowers and withdrew his resignation. He argued that their team could accomplish the mission successfully because they had better combat experience than other teams, having handled operations in Somalia and Desert Storm. Spencer reminded Bowers that by not allowing their team to fight the Taliban, Bowers would lose the chance to win. Finally, Bowers agreed to Spencer's request and allowed Spencer to join the team, with Nelson as their captain. Ultimately, each soldier spent time saying goodbye to their families. Spencer's wife was still upset about her husband's decision despite his plans to retire. Similarly, his child was speechless. Diller's wife, although trying to appear strong in front of him, was anxious and upset about the situation. Nelson couldn't assure Jean that he would return, but she made him promise to come back. The next day they arrived at a military base in Uzbekistan. Nelson and Spencer were briefed by their superior, Colonel Mulholland, who provided detailed information. They learned that the mastermind behind the bombing was bin Laden, but the Taliban, as the Afghan army, controlled the territory. Colonel mentioned a person named General Dostum, the commander of the Northern Alliance of Afghanistan, who planned to capture Mazar-i-Sharif, the fourth largest city in Afghanistan under Taliban control. Colonel was confident that Dostum's forces could not defeat the Taliban alone, so their mission was for Nelson's team to collaborate with Dostum's forces to attack the Taliban, with the U.S. military providing air support. Nelson's team would be deployed in northern Afghanistan to meet a CIA agent who would guide them to Dostum's location. They needed to earn Dostum's trust, join forces, and fight alongside him to capture the Taliban's defenses. After securing air support, Dostum would take over and capture Mazar-i-Sharif, leading to the Taliban's collapse. Colonel gave the team 1 week, but Nelson believed they could complete the mission in 3 weeks. He knew from Russian soldiers who had served there that snow would fall in the mountains by mid-November, complicating the mission. Thus, Nelson aimed to expedite the mission with his team. He convinced Colonel that their method of cooperating with foreign forces and securing hard-to-reach air support, being the first such mission in their administration, would lead to success. Colonel supported Nelson's plan to win the battle. After that, Nelson informed his team that they would assist Dostum's forces, consisting of 200 soldiers, against the Taliban and their own enemy, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, with a total of 50,000 troops. This meant that each one of them would have to defeat 5,000 enemies. Nelson mentioned that they would depart that night with a single plane without any assistance. One of them asked if the flight test had ever been successful. Nelson replied that they were the first to test the flight to Afghanistan, because this mission was America's first retaliation against the terrorists who attacked their country. After a tense flight, they arrived on Afghan soil. They then met their guide, who would take them to General Dostum. They were provided with a place to rest and given extensive information about Dostum's forces. The next morning, Dostum's forces arrived on their horses, and they discussed how to assist and attack each other. Initially, Dostum was hesitant to cooperate with Nelson's team, but eventually he agreed to the collaboration. Dostum then provided Nelson's team with 6 horses. Nelson protested, because his team consisted of 12 members. How could they manage with only 6 horses? Dostum explained that he only had 6 horses left. Nelson had no choice but to split his team into 2 groups, although he was reluctant to do so. Nelson then asked his team who could ride horses, and only a few were capable. Nelson gave a brief lesson on horseback riding to his team. After that, he asked for the exact location of Mazar-i-Sharif. Meanwhile, a harrowing incident occurred at the city border, where a Taliban leader named Razan was about to execute a mother caught teaching her daughter to read and write. There was a rule that no girl under 8 years old could receive an education. Without hesitation, Razan shot the mother. Meanwhile, Dostum's forces and Nelson's team finally arrived in the village of Dehi. They then set up a resting place in the Chobaki cave. That night, during a conversation between Nelson and Diller, Dostum approached them and asked Nelson why his men were on guard. Dostum said that protecting Nelson's team was his responsibility because American soldiers were his guests. Nelson replied that they were trained to follow orders. If not ordered, they wouldn't act. Dostum said that they had a difference. American soldiers had subordinates, while Dostum's forces had gods. The next morning, they were ready to fight. Dostum informed them that the Taliban forces, led by Razan, were ahead. Nelson then shared his plan to move closer to provide accurate coordinates and elevation. However, Dostum warned that it was very dangerous because 500 of his men could die, and if one of Nelson's team died, the US government would leave, and Dostum's forces would lose the war. Nelson insisted on advancing because if they did not get the exact location, the airstrike would miss. Dostum didn't care, and forced Nelson to drop the airstrike. Air support was contacted to drop rockets on Razan's forces. However, their attack slightly missed, and many of Razan's troops survived and fled. Nelson did not remain idle. Ignoring Dostum's orders, Nelson recklessly went alone to find new coordinates. When Nelson provided the new coordinates, he and a comrade who came to help were attacked. Nelson decided to call off the airstrike and retreated because the bombs were coming. The first mission was successful, as the bombs hit the target accurately. The next day, Nelson and his team, along with Dostum's forces, gathered at the city border. The US forces contacted air support again for an airstrike. After that, Dostum immediately ordered his troops to advance on horseback and told Nelson's team to stay put. In the midst of the battle, Nelson saw a tank attacking Dostum's forces. Nelson requested air support, but the support was out of fuel and needed to return to base. Seeing Dostum's forces about to be slaughtered, Nelson quickly ordered his team to protect their retreat path. Arriving at the battlefield, Nelson instructed everyone to retreat because the air support could not arrive yet. That night, while resting, Dostum informed Nelson about the detailed location of Mazar-e-Sharif and said there was only one way there, through the Tiangi Pass, a narrow path. To pass through it, they had to capture the base camp city first. Dostum then shared clever warfare tactics, which made Nelson promise to win this battle. The next day, Nelson gathered his team. He informed them that they would attack through the Tiangi Pass because that's where the Taliban stored a lot of ammunition. So if they could destroy that place, they could easily defeat the Taliban. Nelson asked for volunteers to head to the pass, and 3 people volunteered. Spencer and 2 comrades stepped forward, and Nelson approved. On the 8th day, Nelson contacted Spencer, who was still at Alamo. He requested Spencer and the team to come to his location using the provided horses. Finally, they all gathered and strategized to attack when air support dropped the bombs. In short, the bombs were successfully dropped, hitting the enemy and destroying their tanks. Nelson's team and Dostum's forces then moved forward slowly. Meanwhile, Spencer and a comrade monitored from a hilltop. As Nelson's team approached the wall, the enemies were behind it, ready to attack. Spencer observed this through binoculars and informed the team. Suddenly, they managed to win the battle, and the base camp city was now under their control. Today, Dostum's forces, assisted by US troops, bombed the Taliban forces. While resting, Spencer told Nelson that their superiors had handed another American team to Atta Muhammad's forces. It turned out Atta's forces were rivals of Dostum's forces. Nelson was worried that if Dostum found out, he would focus on Atta's forces and no longer help them fight the Taliban. However, Nelson had no choice but to inform Dostum when Dostum gave new directives about the next attack location. Nelson immediately informed him that another team like theirs was assigned with Atta Muhammad's forces. Hearing this, Dostum was furious. Nelson then explained that their mission would not change. It's just that Dostum's rival forces now have assistants like Nelson's team helping Dostum's forces. Dostum's concern was that he didn't want his troops to die just to pave the way for Atta's forces to take over Mazar-e-Sharif. Meanwhile, Nelson's team wanted to destroy the Taliban forces first because of what they did to America. Due to their differing opinions, Nelson became angry and expressed his disappointment with Dostum, saying that what he had said about being a knight was nonsense, because Dostum himself cared more about seizing territory than ensuring the local population could live in peace. However, Dostum still left with all his troops. Nelson was confused because only his 12-member team would be fighting the Taliban. Nelson and his team then discussed their next steps. Nelson said he couldn't guarantee his team's safety because this time, it was 12 of them against thousands of enemies. However, if they abandoned the mission, more bombs and attacks would come to their country. They were so close to defeating the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Nelson let his team decide, but he himself would continue to the battlefield. With his patriotism, they all decided to continue the mission with or without Dostum's forces. The next day, Nelson and his team meticulously planned their strategy to attack the enemy and assigned tasks according to their expertise. On the 20th day in the southern Tiangi Pass, that was their battlefield, Nelson and Jones began moving through the pass from the south, monitored by Falls and Michael from afar. Nelson spotted a sniper from the enemy side and immediately informed Falls to shoot. Nelson and Jones finally reached the north side of the pass on a cliff to scout the enemy at the weapons storage. Now the 12 troops were in their positions to attack the thousands of enemies in front of them. Spencer then contacted air support to drop bombs according to the enemy coordinates again. As he was about to provide new coordinates, suddenly Spencer and the others were approached by enemy troops carrying a white flag, signaling their surrender. However, this seemed very suspicious, and Spencer asked everyone to stay alert. Spencer then contacted Nelson and informed him of the situation. Nelson asked them to keep reporting their status. As the enemy got too close, there was suddenly an explosion. Spencer was severely injured and was dying. Black immediately checked on Spencer and contacted all team members to request medical assistance urgently. At the same time, Nelson's team and the others were also attacked by the enemy. As they were surrounded by enemy fire, Dostum's forces arrived to assist them. Seeing Dostum's forces arrive, Razan launched dozens of rockets to annihilate them. Because the enemy numbers were overwhelming, Nelson urged his team to retreat down and mount their horses again. Nelson noted that it would take the enemy 2 minutes to reload their rocket launchers. This was the moment Nelson and the others needed to strike. Nelson and his team moved on horseback, followed by Dostum's forces with their weapons to attack the enemy. They kept shooting relentlessly while the rockets continued to launch. While the rockets were being reloaded, Razan attempted to escape by car. Dostum, seeing this, broke away from the group to chase Razan. Razan's car got stuck in a hole, rendering it immobile. Dostum approached, and without hesitation, shot Razan in the head, killing him instantly. Elsewhere, Nelson and his team successfully defeated the enemy and won the battle. Nelson then approached the dying Spencer. Shortly after, a helicopter arrived to evacuate Spencer. Once Spencer was safely evacuated, Nelson and his team set out to stop Dostum's forces from attacking Atta's forces. Upon reaching Mazar-e-Sharif, a highly contested area in Afghanistan, Nelson was surprised to see Dostum shaking hands with Atta, as if nothing had happened between them. Dostum allowed Atta to control Mazar-e-Sharif, but only for a few more days. After that, Nelson and his team returned to the base in Uzbekistan and then headed home to America. Jean was overjoyed to see Nelson return home. At the end of the story, it was revealed that all 12 members of the U.S. Special Forces Unit ODA 595 survived their mission. The capture of Mazar-e-Sharif by horseback forces was one of the greatest achievements of the U.S. military. Initially, the military estimated it would take 2 years to defeat the Taliban, but in reality, Nelson's team completed the mission in just 3 weeks, which Al-Qaeda considered their greatest defeat. Due to the secrecy of their mission, the 12 team members returned home and lived their daily lives without public recognition. In 2014, General Dostum became the vice president of Afghanistan. Dostum and Nelson remained good friends until today. In 2012, a statue of a horseback soldier was erected at the WTC site in the United States to honor their knightly actions. This is an actual photo of the 12 soldiers, and the film ends. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe. Because by subscribing, you have supported me to make better videos. See you in the next video.